The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on lessons from the field, overcrowding in national parks. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at this hearing are limited to the chair and ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other member opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the following members be permitted to ask questions of witnesses at today's hearing. The member from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, the member from American Samoa, Ms. Radowagen, the member from Montana, Mr. Rosendale. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes to make an opening statement. Welcome to the final Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee hearing of the 117th Congress. It has been an honor to serve as chair and to work with Ranking Member Moore. National parks are our nation's treasures. Our public lands belong to every American, and every American should be able to enjoy the beauty of our parks and public lands. As chair, I've made this issue a top priority. The first hearing that I chaired for this subcommittee focused on making our public lands more accessible for people with disabilities. I fought to increase funding for the Every Kid Outdoors program, which allows every fourth grader and their family to go to our national parks for 1 year for free. National parks matter a lot to me. I grew up on a farm, and for vacation, we often went to national parks, not just because they were beautiful or historic, but because they were affordable. Now, as a mother of 3 children, parks are a classroom, a playground, and once again, a place to bond with family. Last year, I wanted to go camping to Zion with my kids. I managed to navigate the recreation.gov app, and we were lucky enough to reserve a campsite for 1 night and found an alternative public land site for other nights. We had a great time camping and exploring in Zion, but as with any major attraction, it was pretty crowded, had lots of traffic, and not everyone was able to get to see what they wanted to. I was fortunate there to meet with Mr. Brady Baugh, and I'm glad he's here with us today. My time at Zion and my trips this year to Death Valley National Park, Joshua Tree, Indiana Dunes, and Cuyahoga Valley made me wonder how the national park system is protecting its resources while making them accessible to as many people as possible. So I dove in. Some parks, like Yosemite, are national attractions. For parks like that, overcrowding must be actively managed. There are 2 basic ways to deal with this. You can get more pie, or you can divvy up the pie. To get more pie, you develop land, either inside or outside the park, so more people can have a place to stay, to get around, or to hike different trails. However, sometimes you have to divvy up the pie and allocate access. Maybe there's not enough land. Maybe the land needs to be preserved. But our public lands are a limited resource. We cannot always just bake more pie. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to overcrowding in our parks. In some cases, technology is key. In others, acquiring, protecting, and responsibly developing land just outside the parks is the answer. We have to be careful with this because expanding parks in this way can sometimes just attract more visitors without relieving overcrowding. In many cases, parks have had success with managing overcrowding. They have done so by working hard to build consensus with friendly groups, local businesses, and gateway community members. One of the reasons I'm grateful for Mr. Brady Baugh's presence is that I saw this approach at work when I took my family to Zion. I'm also glad to have him here because I wanted to work with my colleague from Utah, Mr. Moore, to showcase the innovation and successes that he has in his own backyard. We had a good conversation about this hearing and found some common ground. We won't agree on everything, but I strongly believe there's room for bipartisan solutions here. One thing I think we can all agree on is that our parks need to make plans for how they're going to handle overcrowding. In fact, parks have been required by law since 1978 to figure out how many visitors their park can handle and to make a plan to manage visitation. In preparing for this hearing, I learned that very few parks have made these plans. Today, I hope to learn about why and what barriers parks are facing to doing the planning that they need. In preparing for the hearing, I came across a number of causes of overcrowding that are deserving of further oversight. Concessions are often overpriced due to local monopolies. The Office of Management and Budget is holding up information needed to manage overcrowding. Visitors are having difficulty with recreation.gov and the contractor who operates it, Booz Allen Hamilton. Solving overcrowding in our national parks also means dealing with these concerns and making sure families are not priced out of our national treasures. So there's still work to do today and in the following Congress, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. I now turn it over to my colleague from Utah, Ranking Member Moore, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Porter. Today's hearing highlights an important challenge facing some of our most visited national parks. While a select number of national parks are witnessing rapidly increasing visitation numbers, it is crucial that the National Park Service give individual parks the flexibility to respond to the unique set of circumstances that each park is facing. Overall, it is encouraging to see more Americans and international travelers traveling to see our nation's natural beauties. We protect these treasures so that the public can go and enjoy them. Our parks should resist the temptation to simply limit the number of visitors who can enter. Instead, we should pursue innovative and common sense solutions that address the challenges of overcrowding while maintaining access to our parks for the greatest number of people. Today, I am particularly pleased to be joined by Hannah Downey from the Property and Environment Research Center. I look forward to learning more about the different approaches parks can utilize to disperse visitors within parks and surrounding areas to alleviate pressure points associated with overcrowding. By capitalizing on technological developments and public-private partnerships, parks handling a rising number of visitors will be able to maintain a positive visitor experience while negating the impacts of overcrowding. Additionally, I am interested in discussing the ways parks should engage with local gateway communities. An open dialogue with these communities is necessary for implementing effective solutions. We also have the opportunity to lessen the consequences of overcrowding through legislative action. Let's talk about the retaining and recruiting employees to work at our national parks. With appropriate staffing levels, parks are better able to handle increased number of visitors. One of the issues impacting the ability to retain and recruit staff is the rising cost of housing in our gateway communities. That's why I introduced the Lodge Act. This legislation would give the National Park Service the flexibility to enter into partnerships with non-federal entities and other federal agencies to develop employee housing. With increased housing options, parks would be able to recruit more employees, helping to lessen consequences of overcrowding, like longer wait times and garbage accumulation. We could also negate the impacts of overcrowding by targeting Great American Outdoors Act funding at parks with increased visitors to make sure that the Great American Outdoors Act funds are targeted again to places with increasing visitors. I look forward to discussing Zion National Park's maintenance backlog with Superintendent Jeff Bradybaugh, who's joining us today. Despite having $58 million in deferred maintenance, no projects for Zion National Park were included in the National Park Service fiscal year 2023 of that project list to receive legacy restoration funds. It's unfortunate, and I am disappointed that National Park Service Director Sams declined Chair Porter's invitation to attend today's hearing. It's our job up here to invite government witnesses, and it's their job to be here to testify. Addressing backlog projects and maintaining a park infrastructure are crucial components of combating the consequences of overcrowding. I have significant concerns about how the Biden administration is allocating legacy restoration funds and the process through which maintenance projects are selected. It defies logic that our nation's second most visited park would not receive funds to complete maintenance projects. Today's hearing gives us the opportunity to discuss innovative solutions to a serious issue. It's my hope that Americans will continue to take advantage of the gems within our park system, and that we equipped our national parks with the flexibility needed to handle visitors more effectively and efficiently. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Moore. I would like to turn to our first panel and introduce our government witness. Mr. Jeff Bradybaugh is the Superintendent of Zion National Park for the National Park Service. Let me remind all witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely pin the timer so it remains visible. It's now the chair's pleasure to recognize Mr. Bradybaugh to testify.
Chair Porter and Ranking Member Moore and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the department's views on lessons from the field, overcrowding in national parks. The past few years have reminded us how important national parks and public lands are to our overall well-being. Ensuring visitors have enjoyable experiences, however, is becoming increasingly challenging in most of our popular parks. There are 423 units in the national park system, but visitation trends vary greatly. About half of all recreation visits annually occur in the top 25 most visited parks, with significant congestion seen in most popular destination parks. The National Park Service is employing a range of park-specific strategies to provide a welcoming environment while ensuring protection of nationally significant resources. The National Park Service has long managed access in backcountry areas and wilderness by issuing trailhead and overnight permits. Parks are working with local partners to develop strategies for promoting sustainable tourism. To address vehicular congestion, we have invested in shuttles and multi-use paths, and biking and walking are encouraged. And as we test new ideas and planning tools, we are conducting robust public and stakeholder engagement before committing to long-term implementation. Timed entry systems are now in place in a few parks such as Muir Woods National Monument and Acadia National Park, where they have improved the visitor experience. Glacier, Rocky Mountain, and Yosemite National Parks have piloted timed entry reservation systems to address specific park level issues and have gained key insights into how these systems could contribute to the park's long-term management goals. At Zion National Park, where I am superintendent, we welcomed 5 million visitors for the first time in 2021. In response to visitor comments and as part of our long-range visitor use planning, Zion began issuing permits for one of our most popular trails, the route to Angel's Landing. This pilot permit program has improved visitor experience by decreasing crowding and congestion on this precipitous trail. We also tested timed tickets for our bus system during the height of the pandemic. This maximized visitor access to Zion Canyon while accommodating COVID limitations to bus capacity. We will use data collected during these pilot projects, along with data collected from almost a decade of research, to inform potential future management alternatives for Zion National Park. The National Park Service is also working to improve the visitor experience through trip planning tools, including the NPS mobile app and continued improvements to recreation.gov. In addition, the National Park Service Plan Like a Park Ranger campaign supports visitors by advising them to have backup plans, know in advance where reservations or permits are needed, and encouraging people to explore lesser-known parks. The National Park Service wants visitors to have a great park experience. Given the iconic and finite nature of these highly valued places, The National Park Service is committed to collaborating with local communities, businesses, and nonprofit partners to find solutions that improve the quality and the inclusivity of visitor experiences, address congestion in a thoughtful way, and maintain the tremendous range of benefits that national parks provide. Chair Porter, Ranking Member Moore, thank you again for the opportunity to appear today. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Bradybaugh. I will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask, reminding them that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. I'll start by recognizing myself. Mr. Bradybaugh, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for overcrowding, but there are actions that parks can take. And when we met, when I was visiting Zion, and today, you have talked about different kinds of strategies that you've seen used at Zion and other parks where you've worked to manage the surge of visitors, the threat of overcrowding. And in your written testimony, you've shared, and in your oral testimony, some of the ways that Zion has addressed this and responded. What lessons can you offer to this committee and to others, other park managers and other national parks from Zion's experience with such increased visitor capacity, increased visitorship?
One of the principal lessons learned and key to really all of our management actions are to develop partnerships and work with our local communities. We know that visitors don't just come to national parks. They are welcomed in our gateway communities. They attend businesses and support an economy in our region. We have nonprofit partners that assist us in planning and provide some funds that help us in those ways. What's really important is to engage with the local community, our local elected officials, our state tourism organizations, our departments of transportation that we need to coordinate both within and outside the park when we're dealing with traffic congestion in particular. Those are some key things that we look at when we're developing techniques for visitor use planning. How are people arriving? What are their routes? Where do visitors tend to concentrate? We need to understand those visitor patterns. And they may vary. They may be seasonal in nature. They may be affected how people utilize the park in terms of times of day. Our shuttle system is critical here in Zion to managing use in Zion Canyon and in the adjacent community of Springdale.
So in terms of harnessing and connecting with those local communities and those gateway communities, the partners, the businesses, making a plan to manage visitor use is a tool for doing that. Can you tell the committee why? Well, first let me ask you this. Does Zion have a visitor management plan for the park?
We are working on a visitor use management plan as we speak and have been for several years. Visitor use management plans are a means for us to identify the strategies for managing visitor use and access and to steward the park's cultural and natural resources while providing a high quality visitor experience.
What are the barriers? One of the things that we've learned in preparation for this hearing is that very few national parks have their plans for visitor use management completed and in place. And what are the barriers to parks in doing this? How can this committee better support parks in getting visitor use management plans made? Because I think the process can be, and I think you've seen this in your career, very, very useful. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. This isn't something we can necessarily legislate, but What makes it hard to get a visitor use management plan done? Why is Zion working on it but not finished? And why do you think other parks are struggling sometimes to even get started?
I think here in Zion, we're trying to be very deliberate about our process. In our engagement with our cooperating agencies, which include 4 county commissions, the state of Utah through their Office of Tourism and their Public Lands Policy Office, our Gateway Community, Bureau of Land Management, which manages a great deal of federal land surrounding us. These are important connections, and these agencies bring specific expertise, knowledge, and experience to the questions that revolve around crowding and congestion in the parks. As we work on alternatives for a plan, we're considering education, how we relate to the information to the visitors, their trip planning, how we may target specific infrastructure investments, and how we need to adjust day-to-day operations. Those are some of the basic elements in a plan, but there's also a lot of information that needs to be collected. We've invested over a decade of research and information collection to discern what the visitor use patterns are for Zion and the surrounding area. And as I mentioned earlier, we have to consider that visitors are coming to parks, but they are in a larger environment in a regional setting. And so we need to have information from and technical expertise from these other agencies.
Thank you very much. I'm going to now recognize Mr. Moore for his questions.
Thank you, Chair. Superintendent, thanks again for being here. I represent Utah, as you know. We are very proud of our national parks. I do appreciate the work that you do, particularly with Zion. My questions are all geared towards productivity. They're going to discuss local connection to our local communities, funding, several other items. Our national parks have put our state on the map. And I think back to my time as a young Boy Scout, actually. One of the biggest growth periods of me personally was going on my 2-day trip down the Zion Narrows. My scoutmaster was terrified we weren't going to make it to our camping spot. It was downpouring rain. It was one of the most memorable experiences of my childhood. I want members of my first district, and I want members across the world to experience these great places. We cannot just need to limit the number of people that get there. We have to embrace how we go about doing this. To your knowledge, what has been your experience? Can you expound a little bit on the potential of Zion National Park opening up new trails? Are you supportive of this? Have you worked on anything on this regard?
We have opened some new trails, and we have some plans in addition. As I mentioned earlier, infrastructure needs to be targeted in areas that are experiencing crowding. We can inadvertently increase crowding if those infrastructure additions aren't carefully planned. And so, yes, we consider those alternatives as part of our visitor use plan.
So you're supportive of finding new options for expansion of new trails?
As it relates to our visitor use planning and how that interacts with other conditions where we may have crowding or traffic congestion or those sorts of things. For example, the trailhead, we can develop additional parking perhaps at a trailhead, but if the trail is already being heavily used, increased parking may exacerbate the issue of crowding. So again, we have to think about these things in a broader operational perspective and how those things fit together through our plan.
I've been around the federal government long enough to know that it's always easy for the federal government to always say, oh, there's a process, there's some red tape I'm trying to cut through. It frustrates me too. Our local officials have our state elected leaders, county commissioners that are in some of these gateway communities, they've offered to help with parking, trailers outside the park, notably in East Zion, areas that are often underutilized, adding in bathrooms or camping spaces adjacent to the park, and they're often met with, let's call it, polite rejection. And there's always sort of a, well, we would love to do that too, but there's this process we got to go through. Are you engaging with these local leaders to come up with innovative solutions, pushing the envelope, thinking outside the box, and not just relying on the way things have always been done? Post-COVID, people are loving our outdoors. We cannot just continue to do things the way we've always done it, and it's going to require folks from inside the bureaucracy to push on it. Are you advocating on behalf of this?
We're working very closely with our elected officials locally, and I'd like to point out one of the things that we are involved in, along with other land managers, state and parks managers, Forest Service, BLM managers, local community leaders, and business people in our regional recreation planning. I've long advocated that we need to look beyond our boundary and think about how we're managing visitation in a regional perspective. So thanks to our county commissioners, some business people that are helping to sponsor this effort, our nonprofit Zion National Park Forever project. This group has commissioned a program within the Conservation Fund, which is a national nonprofit, called their losing the term here, Balancing Nature and Commerce program, to bring together these entities to look at some of these issues as they affect the park and beyond, and work towards solutions. So we're looking at transportation issues and opportunities. We're looking at additional camping and recreational trails. There's a whole number of potential solutions, but we have to understand what the capacity of those areas beyond the park boundaries as well are, and what perhaps targeted infrastructure needs may exist.
One of my biggest takeaways, Superintendent, one of my biggest takeaways from my first term of Congress is how sincere and engaged our local officials are in Utah about solving these problems. I urge you to, I love your responses. I urge you to follow up and be willing to engage on this. I'll yield back and hope to get a few more questions.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Moore, first and foremost, for holding this important hearing, and to you, Madam Chair. I appreciate your willingness to hold this hearing and your initiative in providing this critical oversight on an issue that impacts every one of our districts. As you know, I chair the Public Lands, National Parks and Forests Subcommittee of the full committee, but I also happen to represent a district that is home to some of the most iconic national parks in the United States, including Rocky Mountain National Park. And overvisitation, the realities of larger and larger crowds of visitors ascending and descending rather onto Rocky Mountain National Park and many other parks across our country is something that clearly warrants further inquiry and oversight by policymakers, and in particular by this subcommittee. And so again, I thank Madam Chairwoman, you for your leadership in initiating this hearing. My apologies that I've been going in and out. We have a simultaneous hearing, as we all do, I know, on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Today's our last and final hearing for that important committee. But nonetheless, I wanted to be sure to attend this hearing so that I could hear some of the questions and some of the answers. And I guess I wanted to make just two observations. First, I wanted to underscore the point that Ranking Member Moore articulated, which is to say that local leaders, and certainly this is the case in my jurisdiction, in my state, in the communities that I represent, but I suspect this is true of many other countless communities across our country, and in particular the Rocky Mountain West. Local leaders are prepared and willing to engage in innovative, collaborative practices with the National Park Service to try to address some of these challenges, but they ultimately need a partner. And I know that NPS has been open to exploring some of those collaboratives in the past. And I would just, I suppose, echo the comments that were made previously by my colleagues in encouraging the National Park Service to continue to be agile and flexible in working with local communities to try to address this on a case-by-case basis. And then secondly, I guess I suppose this could be a question for you, Mr. Brady Bob, but it's perhaps a bit of an observation as well. I understand that the NPS is engaged in long-term planning and trying to kind of find a way forward in navigating this very complex and cumbersome issue, and that you don't have plans to necessarily adopt a reservation system in 2023, which, as you know, has been used as a pilot in a variety of different national parks, including Rocky Mountain National Park in my congressional district. I wonder what your timeline is for codifying a long-term plan to address this issue. And perhaps that's too big a question, but I think you hear from members on this committee, and I suspect from others, a sense of urgency of wanting to make sure that we have specifics in terms of timing as to when the NPS will be in a position to actually implement a long-term plan to address this particular challenge.
Thank you for that question. As it's been mentioned, each park is a unique entity in that it has its own circumstances. And as we do planning, we're looking at those specific conditions and set of circumstances which affect potentially crowding or congestion. One of the things that we have done, as you mentioned, is piloting different types of access management. And it's important for us to learn from those and take the lessons forward when we're addressing plans at specific parks. So as was mentioned earlier, it's not one size fits all. We do need to understand how these particular situations in different parks manifest themselves. And it may be specific areas in a park as opposed to a park in general. And where we see congestion and overcrowding is often place-based. And as we make adjustments in management, we often see that there can be cascading effects across other park operations or other areas. And so as we're doing our planning, we're gauging those things. We put in place monitoring systems so that we can measure the effects of those changes and then carry those lessons forward.
Thank you. Well, I will yield back the balance of my time, but again, thank you, Chair Porter, for initiating this hearing, and certainly know that you have a partner in me to the extent that we can explore potential legislative solutions to give the NPS the tools they need to address this challenge.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Superintendent Braball, I've been very fortunate to visit many of the national parks around the country, and I have been to Zion myself. And it seems to me in every one of these locations, while the vast majority of the park itself does not have any impact, or if so, very, very little impact, what we need to do seems to identify the areas where the greatest impact is taking place, and then figure out a way that we can distribute some of that traffic so that it doesn't cause problems with the infrastructure and with the wildlife populations. I don't know that we have a perfect answer for that, but as we're discussing Zion, I would like to give the balance of my time to Representative Moore, who is right there in that district. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Rosendale. Continuing on, thank you, Superintendent. Zion National Park, a backlog of $58 million in deferred maintenance. We passed a bill, Congress did several years ago, Great American Outdoors Act, and could have been a great opportunity to target funding to where it's needed to be. I'm not saying that Zion needs the funding because I represent Utah. It's the second most visited park in the nation. The first most visited park, where is it? Can't be better than Zion, wherever it is. Exactly, can't be better than Zion. That's my bias coming through. This is, the Utah stakeholders are baffled by this. We get the runaround, finding out the amount of money that went to the Washington, D.C., Virginia Beltway instead of going to the backlogs of places that actually, that need it more. Is the same do you feel the same frustration in your office? Have you raised any concerns with this on your end?
Well, we follow a process to identify priorities across the Park Service, and certainly those begin at the park level. We actually are funded for a Great American Outdoors Act project at Zion, which is a complete rehabilitation of our South Campground, which is a 120 site campground that has 98 to 99% occupancy. Yet it hasn't had much work in terms of restoration of utilities and campsites and restrooms and all those amenities found in a campground for decades. And so we are in the engineering and development process right now for that project and look forward to moving ahead with that. We appreciate that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please, continue.
Yeah, we recognize that the Great American Outdoors Act for our parks is a great opportunity to make progress on our backlog of deferred maintenance, whether that's facility related or it could even be protection and management of cultural resources or natural resource sites. Also, the bipartisan infrastructure law is providing funds to address some of those deferred maintenance and other projects in the parks. And at the park level, we identify those projects and initiate those as project proposals.
Would you see that the visitor experience at Zion has been impacted by a lack of funding? The lack of funding to address these backlog maintenance projects. I know you say there's some things in the works. It's been tough to figure out where it's going, what it's ultimately going to do. Has it impacted visitation with the lack of funding there?
Well, we certainly feel visitation that has increased rapidly. In the last decade in particular, and even in the last 5 or 6 years. And it's difficult to adjust in terms of park operations and facility maintenance. For example, we saw 3 consecutive years, 2015, 16, and 17, where visitation increased by more than 500,000 visitors each of those 3 years. The backlog and facility maintenance, of course, hasn't developed in just the last decade or the last several years. It's a long-term process, and we utilize a number of different fund sources, including our repair and rehabilitation fund, our cyclic maintenance funds, other project funds, line item construction, federal lands highway program, and other sources of funding to address these components.
Superintendent, thank you. I'm out of time, but I'll end with this. I know I will speak for Representatives Curtis and Stewart that cover majority of the national parks in Utah on the southern end. Our offices stand ready to assist your team as you advocate for the proper type of funding so we can improve and address this issue. And I sincerely communicate that you have a role to play here from within the bureaucracy, like I mentioned earlier, to advocate on behalf. We have to use these funds and target them in the right direction. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
With the ranking member's permission, I'm going to start a second round of questions so I can follow up. Mr. Bradybaugh, on the Zion website, it shows that from 2010, so in the last 10, 11 years, visitation has gone up by 90%, from about 2.6 million to 5 million. In that same period, the number of full-time equivalent employees has gone down. It was 184, and now it's down around 177. How is staffing difficulties affecting your ability to manage visitorship? When I personally visited, there was a line upwards of an hour to be able to get into the park. When we got there, and my very excited fourth grader tried to give her Every Kid Outdoors paperwork and get a badge, we were told that there's no time for this, just pull in, move on. We don't have time to help you right now. You and I stood outside the visitor center to the national park, and lines and crowding, pushing, frustration. Do you need more staff? How many more staff? If the Inflation Reduction Act, which allocates $500 million for staff hires at National Park, if some of that were to come to Zion, what kind of staff would you hire? What kind of staffing plans? And how could this help us with visitorship?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The Inflation Reduction Act and the funds that are made available through that for staffing in parks will be effectively used, I feel, in visitor services, facility maintenance, and conservation of our resources in the park to protect those values for which visitors come to the parks. That's a significant improvement, and we look forward to implementing that.
I just want to help encourage you. I hope to work with Ranking Member Moore to try to make sure that some of that Inflation Reduction Act money goes to Zion and other parks that both are facing high visitorship and are leaders in thinking about how to balance increased capacity, increased visitorship with quality of experience and protecting resources. And I've seen firsthand some of what you've done there in terms of permitting, in terms of having a shuttle bus system. But as you and I both know, there's a line sometimes an hour plus long to get onto the shuttle bus. And so I hope we can fight to get you some of that funding, to get you some of that staffing. I'll just observe for the committee that Disneyland in Orange County had about 8 million visitors in 2021. Zion had 5 million. And there are a heck of a lot more employees at Disneyland. Now, obviously, it's different. The role of a park employee is different, but I think we do need to give more staffing, in part because I really do want to see every park complete its visitor use management plan. And you need bandwidth to be able to do that. And it's almost as you can't manage the capacity and you're distracted into trying to manage capacity, it takes you away from doing the planning that would let you better manage the capacity in the future. So I thank the ranking member for allowing me to ask a question, and I'm going to respectfully suggest, if it's okay with you, ranking member, we move on to panel 2. Okay. With that, thank you, Mr. Bradybaugh, very much for being here. We really appreciate you doing that. And what we're going to do now is go ahead and transition to our second panel. Before we introduce the second panel, I want to remind our non-administration witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses can refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. I want to introduce our witnesses. Mr. Frank Dean is the President and CEO of the Yosemite Conservancy. Ms. Hannah Downey is the Policy Director for the Property and Environment Research Center, and Dr. Will Rice is an Assistant Professor of Outdoor Recreation and Wildland Management at the University of Montana. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start. It will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. After all of the witnesses have testified, members will ask questions. The chair now recognizes Mr. Frank Dean to testify. Mr. Dean, I believe you're on mute, sir.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman Moore, Porter, and Ranking Member Moore, and members of the committee. My name is Frank Dean, and I'm the president and CEO of the nonprofit Yosemite Conservancy, a charitable foundation for the park. I also currently serve as the chair of the National Park Service Friends Alliance, a coalition of over 100 park partners that provide philanthropic support for national parks across the country. I join you today in support of using day-use reservation systems in overcrowded national parks. In 2019, Yosemite National Park experienced near record visitation with 4.5 million visitors. There was traffic congestion and even gridlock in July and August of 2019, and the number of cars in Yosemite Valley exceeded the maximum cap that was established by a U.S. District Court settlement in 2014, making the park vulnerable to possible litigation from conservation groups. At the request of the Park Service, Yosemite Conservancy retained a transportation planner in 2019 to collect traffic data and identify possible solutions, including tracking how long people actually stayed inside the park. This data and planning would prove to be crucial to reopening Yosemite during the global pandemic. COVID-19 pandemic forced Yosemite to close in March of 2020. National Park Service managers and in conjunction with Department of Interior officials in Washington agreed to reopen Yosemite in June of 2020 at reduced service levels and required day-use reservations for visitors not staying in the park, campgrounds, or hotels. The reservations were available on recreation.gov's website for a $2 fee. The reservation program ended for this peak season in late September, and Yosemite served 2.2 million visitors in 2020. The reservation system in Yosemite received significant media coverage, but it was apparent that many people were not aware of this system because some were turned away at the entrance stations after driving to the park, including many Spanish-speaking visitors. In 2021, the pandemic conditions were still prevalent, and Yosemite continued the reservation system from May through September. Some system refinements were made to allow more visitors to enter the park as COVID cases declined. Yosemite Conservancy also assisted with funding a communications outreach to Spanish language radio and social media, including creating an online video in Spanish to help people navigate the recreation.gov reservation website. Yosemite served 3.3 million visitors in 2021. This year, given the lingering COVID conditions, along with several large road repair projects that were closing several areas of Yosemite, the park implemented a revised day-use visitor system from May through September, necessarily only during the peak hours of 6 a.m. through 4 p.m. This timed entry model system provided access to park visitors who were unable to secure a day-use reservation. The Spanish language outreach continued. The reservation system has resulted in less people visiting the park and has affected the regional business community that serves the park visitors. It's difficult to quantify these impacts, as the park was also closed for other reasons at different times over the past few years due to wildfires and COVID-related staffing shortages. The National Park Service recently announced that they will begin a public input process on December 9th, later this week, to determine a long-term solution to Yosemite's visitor and traffic management issues. Given the pandemic has largely subsided, the park does not plan to have a day-use reservation system in 2023 as they review various alternatives, including a timed entry option. This will be a NEPA compliance process with the goal of a final decision by 2024. Working with the park gateway communities and businesses will be essential to the success of any program going forward. As Yosemite's nonprofit partner, Yosemite Conservancy was nimble and had the resources to support the National Park Service by quickly funding and implementing a day-use reservation system and producing the necessary public materials. Overall, the managed access programs have created an improved visitor experience in Yosemite and at a much less costly solution than constructing additional parking and shuttle bus operations. In conclusion, I support the option of using day-use reservations or timed entry systems in national parks that experience overcrowded conditions. This concludes my prepared remarks. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. The chair now recognizes Ms. Hannah Downey to testify.
Thank you. Chairwoman Porter, Ranking Member Moore, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss ways to address the challenges and solutions to increased visitation in our national parks. My name is Hannah Downey. I'm the Policy Director at PERC, the Property and Environment Research Center, a conservation research institute based in Bozeman, Montana. PERC is the national leader in market solutions to conservation, with over 40 years of research on how aligning incentives for environmental stewardship produces better outcomes for land, water, and wildlife. I count myself as one of the lucky few to live in the shadow of Yellowstone National Park. I've witnessed firsthand the joy of so many people getting to experience the wonders of our first national park, but also the challenges that have come with the park's growing popularity. Americans are rediscovering the outdoors in record numbers. Recently, park visitation grew by more than 20% in just 3 years, and it has stayed high. Despite overall system visitation growth, the impacts are not felt equally. Last year, 44 out of the 423 National Park System units set records for visitation, and parks hosted a total of 297 million recreation visits. More than half of those visits, however, were to just the 25 most visited parks in the country, representing just 6% of the national park system. To further complicate matters, those visitors do not disperse evenly. Yellowstone National Park, for example, estimates that 98% of visitors never get more than a half mile away from their car, using just 1% of the park. While it is encouraging to see widespread enthusiasm for our parks, congestion in popular areas is negatively impacting visitors, park service personnel, and the natural resources that our parks were created to protect. There are two primary ways Congress and the National Park Service can work together to meet these historic challenges. First, they must empower park superintendents with the flexibility to respond creatively with approaches best suited for their individual parks. And second, they must also address maintenance needs in the parks. Addressing the challenges of increased visitation will look different for each park based on park geography, amenities, and goals. Congress should be careful to not impose a one-size-fits-all solution. Consider one example from our backyard. Yellowstone National Park recently faced a visitor pressure point at the popular Madison Junction, where cars waiting to turn routinely backed up for miles. The park transportation study explored adding an overpass or a roundabout, which would have cost millions of dollars and taken years to complete. Instead, an employee suggested a quick and cheap proposal, adding an all-way stop sign. Superintendent Cam Shawley decided to give it a try, and the results have been impressive. The crowded pressure point has been alleviated, improving the experience for visitors and making traffic management easier for park employees. Other approaches could include use of parking attendants to reduce frequent parking lot congestion, using technology such as webcams or visitation heat maps to inform visitors in real time what areas of the park are most crowded, implementing shuttle buses, or using reservation systems where appropriate. Another approach is to look at how we can better encourage visitors to explore public lands outside of a park on busy days. These approaches will have to be unique to each national park and done in coordinated manner with neighboring public land managers and gateway communities. The National Park Service can also explore how to better feature less popular parks. The second thing Congress and the National Park Service need to address is infrastructure and maintenance needs in our parks that are further stressed by more users. The deferred maintenance backlog now totals nearly $22 billion and includes everything from eroding trails, crumbling roads, failing wastewater systems, and dilapidated visitor facilities. Significant funding was provided through the Great American Outdoors Act, but the reality is that the underlying issue remains unresolved, which is a lack of attention to routine maintenance. Fortunately, national park visitors can be a part of the solution through existing funding models that direct visitor fees back onto the ground in the parks where they were collected. Congress can renew the Federal Lands Recreation Enhancement Act to ensure entry fees stay in the parks where they are collected, and also improve policy to ensure park superintendents have the flexibility to spend those dollars where they are most needed on the ground to improve the park visitor experience. Increased visitation in the most popular national parks requires unique and innovative solutions. We should celebrate more people using our national parks, but also look for ways to enhance flexibility to use resources. Congress can help ensure with these approaches that our national parks remain accessible and well-managed for all to enjoy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Dr. Will Rice to testify.
Chair Porter, Ranking Member Moore, and members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be able to represent the outdoor recreation research community today at this hearing, and to be able to answer your questions concerning what the research tells us about crowding in national parks. Visitor use management in parks is an incredibly complex task, as people are complex with complex attitudes, motivations, and histories, all of which determine our behavior and subsequent experiences. The challenges and triumphs of over a century of national park management in the United States illustrate that complexity. I'd like to begin with 2 points of clarification. First, it's important to note that freedom is central to outdoor recreation, and in many ways, national parks are emblematic of the larger freedoms we enjoy as Americans. Data confirms that the experience of leisure in parks is motivated by desire for freedom, whether that's freedom from everyday responsibilities or freedom to explore. Thus, managing and regulating the visitor experience and thus limiting freedom in the face of crowding in national parks has impacts on visitors who are seeking a more unconfined experience. Second, crowding cannot necessarily be assumed based on the number of people entering a park. Perceived crowding must be empirically identified based on gathering data on the visitor experience. This is not to say that dense use conditions in national parks are not an issue of high importance. Research has found negative social impacts resulting from increasing visitor use in national parks. Thus, management actions are prescribed to manage or limit use. In recent years, as a management strategy, limiting use in national parks has increased. Managed access stands prominent among this trend. However, serious considerations are in order when managing use in this manner. Such strategies for managing crowding primarily address just one of its causes and generally ignore the characteristics of the visitor or the characteristics and behavior of those the visitor encounters. Research suggests there are also serious ramifications for how we ration in the face of use limits, using reservation, lottery, pricing, or first-come, first-served systems. We must balance equity, efficiency, equality, and need to ensure fair rationing decisions. Unlike the private sector, where price might simply be increased to balance supply and demand, publicly administered goods like entrance permits into a national park require more complex solutions in order to keep these sites accessible for all Americans. According to a 2021 newsletter from recreation.gov, in a popular campground, a would-be camper may have a 0.3% chance of successfully booking a campsite through an online reservation-based rationing mechanism. This chance is likely lower for those with jobs that prevent them from being able to plan trips months in advance, those living in rural areas with limited high-speed internet access, those who simply have jobs that prevent them from being able to be online to make reservations whenever permits are released for reservation. Additional rationing mechanisms have their own trade-offs. At present, however, we lack a research-based best practice to help national park managers as they navigate their options in striking the correct balance when rationing use. Numerous national park units and other federal lands require guidance on how to fairly and efficiently distribute scarce recreation opportunities across dynamic systems. In fact, Dr. Steve McCool wrote 41 years ago that, quote, how managers go about allocating scarce recreation opportunities in face of ever-increasing demand still needs direction and a framework for solutions, close quote. At present, there's still not a framework to help best ration recreation opportunities. As a subject matter expert, I see this as the primary outdoor recreation research need of our time. Unfortunately, the research community, including agency staff, face an increasingly difficult barrier with regards to Office of Management and Budget review of visitor surveys in accordance with the Paperwork Reduction Act. Visitor surveys are our best tool for understanding the visitor experience in park settings, and in national parks and other federal lands, sponsored surveys require review by an OMB desk officer. From an external perspective, within the last 2 years, this review has nearly stalled, and today many survey efforts in national parks are stalled pending OMB approval. As a result, the management actions that rest on the data to be collected are stalled or are continuing on with less information to guide them. I conclude by restating the quoted preamble from a 1997 article which focuses upon a similar theme. Quote, to every complex problem, there is a simple solution, and it is wrong. Close quote. Managing people in national parks requires complex thinking, and as we found time and again, complex solutions, if we are to do it right. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. I want to thank the whole panel for their testimony. We have a 5-minute limit on questions and pending votes, so if it's okay with the ranking member, I'll just get right to it and we'll do as much as we can. Mr. Dean, California is obviously very proud of Yosemite. We're proud that it's one of the most visited national parks. In your testimony, you spoke about that day-use reservation system. And we know it reduced congestion and wait times, but it also had downsides, including confusion. What would you recommend to other parks thinking about implementing some kind of day-use reservation system?
I think it's important to communicate and work with the local communities, the business community in particular, that serve the visitors. But also, there needs to be better pre-trip planning. People should know in advance, have certainty about their visit, where they're going to go, maybe better planning, but also maybe even expediting payment of the entrance fee in advance, which requires better technology at the entrance stations, connectivity, so that those tickets, if you will, or even their annual or their day pass that they normally would pay for is the transaction is smooth. Right now, the entrance stations are typically in the edges of the parks and not often near good cell service and connectivity. So there's some things like that that could be tweaked that would that speed the process up and also provide a better experience if people knew in advance, they had the guidance in advance to plan their visit.
Mr. Dean, I wanted to ask about, I've used recreation.gov mostly, like most Americans, as Dr. Rice said, unsuccessfully. That is, I've used it and not been able to find a campsite. Once in a while, I have. Can you talk about some of the problems with recreation.gov? Who is it not? I'll direct this first to Mr. Dean, but what are some of the problems with recreation.gov and what should we do about them?
The one thing we realized as we were doing our Spanish language outreach, we were going to point people to the recreation.gov website and that this is how you get a ticket to get into the park, a reservation. We realized the site was not bilingual. It was not in Spanish. And given California's population, that was a problem. That's why we created this how-to video that was posted online on the park's website and on our website as well. So I think that's really a challenge, and just in general, getting the word out. Yosemite gets a lot of publicity, whether there's a fire, a rock slide, or someone gets injured, it's always in the news. But for some reason, this tweak or this change did not reach many people's. I think they thought initially that, of course you need a reservation to camp, but it wasn't really clear that you needed a reservation just to access the park itself. That was the distinction we had to make.
Yeah, and that's increasingly true, needing reservations just to access the park. For example, at Acadia, to do the drive up the mountain. I recently didn't go because I just could not manage, along with everything else involved with taking a vacation as a single mom with 3 kids, to figure that out. And so I guess one of the things I'm concerned about is equity here. Reservation.gov, a lot of those websites, a lot of the reservations are available 6 months out. Congress definitely can't plan 6 minutes out. We definitely can't plan 6 months out. And so I think I've canceled more reservations than I've been able to use. Can you talk a little bit about some of the equity issues involved in recreation.gov? I know there are sort of bots and efforts to kind of pay in some cases to get notified, third-party bots and things that are trying to manage the last-minute cancellations. What do we need to ask Booz Hamilton, who we're paying a lot of money to run this, what do we need to ask them to do to make sure that, whether it's day use or overnight camping use, that this is an equitable process?
I think there could be better communication from the site to helpful guidance to the consumer. Again, it should be in more than just one language, more than English. But it is a very busy system. It's basically become the Uber system for reservations on public lands and for many opportunities. So it seems overwhelmed, and so people complain that they get on the site at the appointed minute or hour 6 months in advance or whatever, and they're still unable to get in because there's so many people vying for those reservations. So that's very frustrating. So trying to communicate it more effectively about tips and how to do it. It's just really a challenge because these are really unique sites. There's only one Yosemite Valley. There's only one Zion National Park. So it's really, they're very competitive places to come see. There is equity, other issues though as well. Do you have high-speed internet at your house and the time at that 7 a.m. hour to, instead of being at work, to actually make the reservation?
Yeah. I thank you very much. Dr. Rice, I'm interested in your research as well. I mean, I think people need to hear that 0.03% chance. It's pretty difficult to make plans to go to a national park and then have your hopes dashed 6 months out. I'm going to turn it over now to Mr. Moore for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Downey, your engagement with our team has been very much appreciated, and candidly, your research and your testimony is sensational. This is evidence-based and this is solution-driven. I only hope that we could actually implement what's in here, and I'll use that as a base for some of my questions. With increased visitation, you have two major things at play. You have visitor experience, and you have a deterioration of our infrastructure. Can you speak to what Great American Outdoors Act funding to actually hit the backlog, that what it's designed to do, could help alleviate those two issues?
Certainly. Thank you, Ranking Member Moore, for the question. The Great American Outdoors Act, and specifically the dedicated funding for deferred maintenance, was long overdue and something that was so incredibly important to addressing some of these visitor needs in our park. As we've kind of hit on already in this hearing, visitors and the increased visitation rates do come with real maintenance costs on our national parks. You look at wastewater systems, roads, trails, parking areas. More visitors means more stress on that infrastructure and more maintenance needs. So you're absolutely correct that it's really important that when we look at visitation, we are also considering not just the visitor experience, but also the park experience and the maintenance of our parks. And so creating dedicated funding for our deferred maintenance and also just routine maintenance so it doesn't become tomorrow's deferred maintenance is incredibly important.
So you're close to all this, so I'm not going to necessarily call you an outsider, but you're not officially a part of the bureaucracy, right? Your research, your policy center comes to this with a solution-driven mindset. What, in your opinion, what's keeping us from being able to better engage with local officials and better embrace technology to actually solve some of these problems?
Thank you, Ranking Member Moore, for that question. I think there's a real opportunity to use some technology, and I think a lot of this just comes from openness to acknowledge it and embrace it, and recognizing that there are other areas or partner groups of the parks who are using some of these approaches, and how can we better implement them in the park visitor experience. For example, I look at with technology, even just the basic use of webcams, and being able to provide a live stream for visitors of what are the actual conditions in a parking lot or at a trailhead or at an entry gate at a point in time, so they can have the information needed to adjust how they plan to use the park that day. And in addition to that, so they can have a true expectation of what the park might look like. You see these incredible pictures of Angel's Landing with no other people around it. And then you go and you're competing against hundreds of other people to hold on to these chains while you're thousands of feet above the ground. And so being able to provide that real information for people so that they can make their own decisions, I think is really important, and there's a great opportunity to use technology and partners to do that.
And dispersion, is that part of the solution you're talking about? Would you care to expound a little bit more on how we can get people to more diverse parts of the parks instead of being, like you mentioned, just a half mile from their parked car?
Yes, thank you. Dispersion is definitely a part of that. I believe others have touched on this as well, but for example, in Yellowstone, 98% of visitors only use 1% of the park. We are so blessed with this incredible park, and certainly we need to be careful in how we distribute users so that we don't have people just climbing into geysers or falling off of cliffs. But at the same point in time, again, providing some of that information is going to be really essential to visitors, and even through things like having parking attendants or representatives or concessionaires who run a lot of this recreation work, able to help inform visitors to those other areas is really essential.
And if only there were a way to get some of the old maps that are stuck in, filing cabinets in the basements of the Department of Interior, if we could only get those accessible through more technological advances like applications on our iPhone. Oh, wait, we passed Mapland out of the Natural Resources Committee this year unanimously and actually did something productive. So we look forward to using Mapland. We look forward to the Lodge Act, to finding an opportunity in the new Congress to be able to help alleviate some of these issues. And I yield back with that shameless plug of my bill this year.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Moore. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Downey, with regard to ideas that Congress could implement, giving national park superintendents more authority to address problem overcrowding, what do you recommend should be changed in order to effectuate that?
Thank you for the question, Representative Gomert. There's real opportunity for Congress to help facilitate a lot of the partnerships to get this done. Representative Moore touched on the Lodge Act, and I think those sorts of approaches are really essential. A lot of these partners are ready to help with many of these things, and there needs to be a message from Congress in coordination with the National Park Service that there's real opportunity here and it should be supported and some of the red tape should be removed. I think of, for example, in Grand Teton National Park, concessionaires now run all of the campgrounds. Certainly there are questions about reservations, how do you get those and all of that, but I think it's really telling that a park has found a way to say, here's an opportunity where we want to create this visitor experience, but we're going to partner with some of these outside groups and oftentimes other volunteer groups to be able to provide that experience. So the more Congress can support the Park Service in that mission, that would be appreciated.
Well, I was shocked about your mentioning the 57 million visitors additionally between 2013 and 2016, when actually between 1992 and 2013, it was flatline. What do you think made the difference in those 3 years where it had been flatline for years before that?
Thank you, Representative. I think you're spot on that it's really important to understand how we got here in order to better understand how we can move forward from here. I think there were a few things that contributed. One is really notably the anniversary of the parks and the Find Your Park campaign. It was wildly successful. Suddenly people had this urge to reconnect and find their park and get out there. It's also really interesting to look at the rise of social media. It's hard to get exact data from there, but Horseshoe Bend, for example, is a really popular National Park Service area, and that went from about 4,000 visitors a year to then, with the rise of Instagram and all of these iconic photos emerging and circulating on people's feeds, over 2 million visitors a year. That's huge. And so there were these campaigns, and also during COVID, people wanted to get outside. Their international trips were canceled. They couldn't go to Disneyland, but they could still take their families camping. So it was kind of this perfect storm of a lot of factors coming together.
Well, also the mention of 423 National Park Service units, 25 had more than half of all of the visits. Is there any way that you think we could get local governments, local businesses to engage? You mentioned partnerships. Seems like there'd be a perfect place for partnerships for local government, local businesses to be advertising local parks, the national parks, to get more visits in those less traveled.
Representative Gomert, I agree with you on that. I think it's very important that all of this is done in coordination with the local communities. For example, we don't want to outsource Arches National Park's visitation challenges to Dead Horse Point State Park, right? And so while there's real opportunity there, it needs to be done carefully and in coordination to ensure that those opportunities exist. I think it's also worth noting that oftentimes people come to the parks to see, they've traveled for miles. They've come from all over the world to see the geysers in Yellowstone. It's a little more complicated than just suggesting they go elsewhere when they've traveled so far to see specific features. But with proper coordination, especially when it comes to like lodging or campgrounds or things like that, localities can implement solutions that work for them.
Well, thank you so much. I'll yield back my time, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rosendale, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Downey, so good to see you. Thanks for joining us. I've got my line of questioning. I basically has broken it out into 3 buckets. The first bucket is the civil engineers, biologists, and basically the infrastructure and the park lands itself. Second bucket is visitor experience, which everyone seems to be talking about as well, which is much, much more difficult to quantify. And then the last bucket I have is the attendance increase as a direct result that we've seen because of COVID and what we're trying to anticipate in regards to that. So on my first bucket, when it comes to doing a good analysis of the needs of the park, if we can look at it as a sub A and B, the infrastructure itself, do we have adequate data on the needs so that as we've gone through the Great American Outdoors Act and we say, do we truly have good data on where those investments need to go?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I think you're correct. It's really important that we understand what are the needs so that we can direct the resources to the most pressing needs. That said, I know Parks Yellowstone, for example, is going through an infrastructure needs assessment so that they can actually have a better sense of what are the needs, what are the dollar figures needed to address that, what are the staff capacity, the partnership needs, all of those things. So I would encourage other parks as well to start looking at that so we have clearer data and better information.
So that is something that really still does need to be compiled with our civil engineers and have them working in that department. Then how about from the biological standpoint, the added impact on increased visitation on the environment itself and the wildlife, how they get impacted? It seems a lot of the time the wildlife become very quickly accustomed to the additional traffic because they're used to having interactions with the humans, but do you the biological data collection too?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I would agree. I think there are real questions about what is the impact to wildlife. You go through Yellowstone, as I'm sure you've experienced as well, and you'll see bears right in the parking lots or right along the roadways, and there are questions of what does this mean? Are we increasing wildlife mortality because they're used to human presence and habituating in areas where they maybe shouldn't be? Beyond that, I think we look at real questions and issues as well with deteriorating maintenance of like failing wastewater systems, for example. Some parks have had their wastewater systems fail and then all of that sewage is going into waterways. Well, what does that mean for wildlife and fish and the visitor experience? It just goes to show all of this is very connected.
And when we start talking about each of the individual parks and gathering that data, we're blessed in our parks right there in Montana, the Glacier and Yellowstone National Park. Cam Shawley is one of the finest people that I have met while I've been serving in government and the most effective gentleman that I have come across. I personally think that if we can have that information distributed to the folks that are making the decisions for their respective parks, before it goes anywhere else, that they're the closest to the issue. Would not they be the ones who are best suited to identify where the issues are?
Congressman Rosendale, certainly the park superintendents are the closest to their parks. They know the local communities. They know the unique pressure points. They know the cultural implications and the challenges that come from managing a park in a specific area. So certainly, I think all of the decisions should be generated at a local level, and what works for one park might not work for another. Yellowstone, for example, when the recent flooding shut down more than half the park, and the park had to reduce visitation quickly, Superintendent Shawley decided, instead of going with a reservation system and the confusion that would come from all of that, he still wanted people to come. So he gathered together local stakeholders, and what they decided to do was implement an odd-even license plate system, where on odd numbered days, people with their license plate ending in an odd number could enter the park. On even days, even numbers. And in that way, there was some sense of certainty amidst this tragedy in the park, that they were able to get creative and use a simple solution so people could have some certainty of when they'd be able to get into the park. And those are the sort of locally led, creative, superintendent-driven solutions and mindset that we need to help solve these problems.
And would you say, it looks like I'm about down to my last time for question, that was also dramatically increased the positive experience that the people that were able to get into the park had as well?
Congressman, I would agree. I think it was a very unique situation, but through a unique approach that was well communicated and bought into by the community, it was fairly successful.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. With the ranking member's indulgence, I'm going to ask a question here to Dr. Rice. Dr. Rice, why is OMB not facilitating any ability to engage visitors and collect data on their park experiences? People's expectations and experiences matter. They're part of what local communities need. They're part of what park superintendents need. Why is OMB not doing this?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Chair Porter. I think as an external, like I do not work for the federal government. I'm fairly external to this process. I'll just explain from my perspective. And my students, for instance, if they want to do their thesis work in helping Yellowstone National Park, where we're trying to get OMB approval for a survey right now, we're going through that process. If they want to submit that survey in order to help people like Camp Shawley understand how do we best manage visitor use? How do we create a managed access system that works, makes sense? How do we inform transit infrastructure planning? Those things rely on understanding park visitor perspectives, because park visitors are a huge stakeholder in this process. In order to collect that data, we have to go through the Office of Management and Budget Review. The National Park Service Social Science Office helps facilitate that. They're fantastic. They provide feedback, and then it's submitted to a desk officer for the Office of Management and Budget, and that's really where the transparency stops. And for us, we don't know where it sits in review. There's no way of contacting that person. And for instance, like I have a student who's had a survey in review for Everglades National Park to inform their wilderness stewardship plan, and that survey has just been sitting there, and that student will graduate before that survey is reviewed. So I can't speak to why it's happening. I can just speak to some of the limitations it puts on park managers trying to do this the right way, trying to do this in a data-driven way, understanding how this will affect visitor experience, understand what visitors' preferences and needs are, and that's thwarted by this stalled process.
I appreciate that. I mean, I think it's called the Paperwork Reduction Act. It's not called the Do Nothing Act. And I think that we need to follow up with OMB to inquire why they're not facilitating the collection of these data. I think most of our park visitors would like to improve the park experience for future visitors and for themselves. And so I intend to follow up on this to see what can be done. With that, if it's acceptable, I'd like to thank everyone for testifying today and move to closing statements. First, I want to thank Ranking Member Moore for working with me on this hearing. Did you want to ask another question? Okay. And for being flexible with their schedules. Ultimately, this is about bringing more people to the national parks, more different kinds of people to the national parks in a way that increases everyone's enjoyment. And there are clearly many opportunities and ways to do that. One of the things that I take away from today is that some of this innovation, whether it's based on technology, whether it's based on increased local partnerships, requires people to direct traffic, people to come up with innovative plans, people to give advice. And I'm proud to say that in the Inflation Reduction Act, we won $500 million for more park staff. I'm looking forward to continuing to understand how we can reduce OMB approval times for collecting visitor experience, how we can make recreation.gov more functional and more fair, and how we can prevent price gouging by concessionaires and improve equity in our parks. On a personal note, I want to say it's been a real pleasure working with you, Mr. Moore. Thank you for your civility, your willingness to always have an open and honest conversation, and your genuine commitment to oversight. As I wrap up this last hearing as the chair of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee, I just want to briefly reflect on what we've done over the last 2 years. I'm really proud of what we've been able to accomplish. We have had hearings on everything from disability access on federal lands to uncovering the role of public relations firms in climate disinformation, from toxic chemicals in tires that harm our salmon, to Americans' responsibilities to manage our nuclear legacy in the Marshall Islands, from keeping serial pollutants from getting taxpayer dollars to the committee's first ever criminal referral to the Department of Justice for bribery involving the former Secretary of the Interior. There is a lot left to do. I am very grateful to Chair Grijalva for supporting me when I pursued the chair and for supporting me through this Congress. I also want to thank the committee staff that has supported me and our members, Lindsay Grissard, Lily Wang, Brian Hackney, Anna Martin, Kelsey Hartman, Chris Martinez, Travis Cady, and Vic Edgerton. It is not an easy thing to turn over the chair, but a peaceful transition like this one is a foundational brick in a healthy democracy. As I like to say, you buy the ticket, you take the ride. The last 2 years in this seat have been a meaningful ride. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions, and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.